I came home and saw that my mom's new husband had moved in with us with his daughter, and then he broke through the wall so that we would call him Dad. Hey everyone, before I get into my story, I just want to ask you all to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. It really helps out, and honestly, not enough people stick around until the end. Alright, let's get into it. Hi Reddit. I never thought my life would take the turn it did. If you had told 10-year-old me that one day my family would completely fall apart, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I had what I thought was the perfect childhood. We weren't rich, but we had a big house in the suburbs, a backyard with a trampoline, and a Nintendo Switch that my younger siblings and I constantly fought over. My name is Adam, and I'm 23 now. I grew up in a pretty normal family with my dad, Greg, my mom, Lauren, my younger brother, Jake, and my sister, Sophie. Dad worked as a manager at a logistics company, and he was the kind of guy who made time for his kids no matter how busy work got. He taught us how to fish, took us camping every summer, and always emphasized that family came first. Mom was a dental assistant, and she was the glue that held everything together. Our house was always clean, warm, and welcoming, mostly because of her. She made sure our favorite meals were cooked, our clothes were folded, and we had everything we needed. Looking back, I realize how lucky we were. There were always home-cooked dinners, movie nights on Fridays, and Christmas mornings filled with excitement. Dad would put up the biggest Christmas tree he could find, and Mom would let us stay up late on Christmas Eve, eating cookies we pretended to leave out for Santa. Then, when I was 14, everything shattered. One evening, Mom and Dad sat us down in the living room and told us they were getting a divorce. No warning signs, no gradual build-up, just a single conversation that tore our world apart. I remember looking at Jake and Sophie, seeing the confusion in their eyes. Jake was only 7 at the time, too young to really understand what was happening. Sophie, who was 10, kept asking if it was a joke. I just sat there, numb, unable to process what they were saying. They told us it wasn't because of another person or a big fight, just that they had grown apart. That phrase still makes me angry to this day. How do two people who built a family together just wake up one day and decide they don't want it anymore? The next few months were a blur. They worked out a 50-50 custody arrangement, so one week we'd be at Dad's, and the next at Mom's new rented apartment. It was a downgrade from what we were used to, smaller, with only 2 bedrooms, so Sophie and I had to share a room, while Jake got the tiny one by himself. At first, I thought things would eventually go back to normal. Maybe they'd change their minds, realize the divorce was a mistake. But as the weeks passed, reality set in. Our family dinners stopped happening. Birthdays became awkward because we had to celebrate twice, once with Mom, once with Dad. Holidays felt emptier. Dad tried to keep things normal when we were with him. He still took us fishing, still cracked the same dumb dad jokes, still made us feel like a family. But Mom, she changed. It was like she wasn't the same person anymore. She started dating way too soon. At least, it felt that way to me. Some guy named Mark was suddenly around all the time, and it didn't take long before we were expected to be nice to him. Sophie tried to keep the peace, always playing the role of the understanding middle child. Jake, being the youngest, adapted better than any of us, but I could tell he missed how things used to be. And me? I just felt betrayed. The worst part? Neither of them ever really gave us a good reason. I wanted to know what went wrong. Was it really just growing apart? Or was there something more they weren't telling us? But no matter how many times I asked, I never got a straight answer. That's when I realized, sometimes, even the people who are supposed to love you the most will leave you with more questions than answers. When I was 18, I came back to my mom's apartment after a week at my dad's place, expecting everything to be the same as usual, messy, cramped, and filled with the awkward silence that had become our norm. But the second I stepped through the door, I knew something was off. The air smelled different, like cheap cologne and cigarette smoke, and there were unfamiliar work boots sitting by the entrance. Then I heard laughter. A deep, rough voice boomed from the kitchen, followed by my mom's familiar, high-pitched giggle. I turned the corner and saw a man I had never seen before sitting at our kitchen table, legs spread wide, a half-empty beer bottle in his hand like he had owned the place for years. He was big, broad-shouldered, with thick arms covered in faded tattoos, a graying beard, and the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller. "Oh, hey, Adam," Mom said, way too casually, like nothing about this was weird. "This is George." I didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, waiting for some kind of explanation. When it didn't come, I finally asked, "Who is he?" Mom rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic. "George and his daughter just moved in. I was going to tell you, but things happened so fast." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "Moved in?" I repeated, trying to process what she had just said. George grinned, flashing crooked teeth. "Yeah, hope that's cool with you, kid." I hated the way he said it. Like it even mattered whether it was cool with me or not. Before I could respond, I saw a movement in the hallway. A girl, probably a little older than me, was standing there, partially hidden behind the doorframe. She had long, dark hair and was nervously twisting a strand of it around her fingers. Her eyes flickered to me, then down to the floor. "This is Lily," Mom added, like introducing them would magically make this situation normal. "She's George's daughter." Lily gave me a quick, awkward nod, but didn't say anything. I turned back to Mom. "So, you just decided to move in a guy we've never met? Without telling us?" "Oh, don't be dramatic," she sighed, waving a hand like it was nothing. "George and I have been seeing each other for a while, and this just makes sense. Plus, the lease is expensive, and splitting rent helps." That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about some whirlwind romance. It was about money. I looked at the apartment. It was already small for the three of us. Now, we were supposed to share it with two more people? I don't get a say in this. I asked. Mom gave me a tight smile. "You're an adult now, Adam. You'll be moving out soon anyway." That stung. I glanced at Sophie, who had just walked in from her room, looking just as confused as I felt. Jake wasn't home yet, but I knew this was going to hit him hard too. I could already tell. I was going to hate living with this guy. At first, George did his best to act like the fun, easygoing stepdad. He brought home ice cream after work like it was some grand gesture, plopped down on the couch pretending to be interested in whatever show we were watching, and even offered to help Jake with his math homework. That last part would have been fine if he actually knew what he was doing, but watching him struggle to explain how to calculate a percentage was almost painful. Still, Jake was polite enough not to call him out on it, and Sophie just ignored him altogether. For a little while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But then the mask slipped. It started small, little moments that felt off. A muttered curse under his breath when something didn't go his way. A sharp tone when he didn't like how someone responded to him. The way Lily tensed up whenever he spoke, her fingers twisting in her hair a little too fast, like she was bracing for something. Then one night, everything changed. Jake had been playing video games in the living room and forgot to put the cup holder back in place after moving it. A tiny, insignificant mistake. But when George sat down and knocked over his beer because the cup holder wasn't where he expected it to be, he exploded. "Are you kidding me?" he roared, standing up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. Jake flinched, his face turning pale. I'm sorry I didn't." George didn't let him finish. With one furious motion, he swung his fist at the wall. The sound of drywall cracking filled the room as his knuckles went straight through it. Dust and bits of plaster crumbled to the floor. Jake was on the verge of tears, his whole body trembling. I was frozen in place, my mind racing between shock and fury. But before I could even move to do something, Mom rushed over, not to protect Jake, but to calm George down. "Oh, it's just a wall, honey," she cooed, running her hands over his shoulders like he was the one who needed comfort. "Don't worry, we'll fix it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake, barely 13 at the time, was sitting there on the verge of breaking down, and Mom was acting like a hole in the wall was the real problem. After that, it only got worse. The outbursts became more frequent. Every week, something set him off. One night, he broke down the bathroom door because dinner wasn't ready when he got home. Another time, he hurled his phone against the wall, shattering it, just because his boss had the audacity to call him on his day off. The worst part was how normal it started to feel. We would hear the sound of something breaking and just keep our heads down, pretending it wasn't happening. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find him tossing the dog's bowl in the trash. When I asked him what he was doing, he just shrugged. Damn thing was in my way. The dog wasn't even ours, it was Lily's. She didn't say anything, just grabbed a plastic container from the cabinet and quietly poured food into it like she had done this before. I wanted to say something, to call him out, to tell Mom that this wasn't okay. But every time I tried, she just brushed it off. "He's just stressed from work," she'd say. "You know how men get." No, I didn't. Because Dad never acted like this. And the worst part? I could see it in Jake's eyes. He was scared. At some point, Mom stopped being Mom. She wasn't the same woman who used to sit with us at the dinner table, asking about our day. She wasn't the woman who used to help Sophie pick out clothes for school or remind Jake to brush his teeth before bed. It happened so gradually that I didn't even notice at first. She stopped going out with her friends, stopped calling her coworkers just to chat, stopped caring about anything that wasn't George. Every conversation in the house revolved around his moods, whether he had a good day, whether he was in one of his tempers, whether we should give him space, because he had a lot on his plate. It didn't matter what was going on in our lives. Mom didn't ask anymore. George had become the center of her world, and the rest of us were just orbiting around him. Then he started pushing for something new. "You kids should start calling me Dad," he announced one evening, setting down his beer bottle with a loud clunk. I mean, I take care of you, don't I? Sophie and I exchanged a glance. Jake looked down at his plate, gripping his fork a little too tightly. Mom smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. I think that's a great idea, honey. No, I said before I could stop myself. The word came out sharper than I intended. George's eyes darkened. What was that? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I have a dad. The air in the room felt heavy. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Mom shot me a warning look, the kind that said, "Don't start." But George just chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Sure. You're a tough guy. But Jake and Sophie? I'm here for them, aren't I? Sophie stayed silent. Jake just nodded, not looking up. I knew what was happening. He was testing us, seeing how much control he really had. And Mom, instead of standing up for us, was helping him. A few days later, I made a mistake. I had just come back from spending the weekend at Dad's. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. One of those days where even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. George was sitting in the living room, feet propped up on the coffee table, watching TV with the volume turned too loud. Mom was in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot. She barely glanced up when I walked in. Did you have a good time at your dad's? I nodded, setting my backpack down. Yeah, Dad took us out too. I didn't even get to finish the sentence before George's voice cut through the room like a blade. What did you just say? I turned to see him sitting up, his eyes locked onto me. I frowned, confused. What? You called him Dad. I realized, too late, what I had done. George stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. I feed you. I put a roof over your head. And you don't respect me? His voice was rising, his face turning red. Mom rushed over, placing a hand on his arm. George, honey, it's not a big deal. The hell it isn't, he snapped, shaking her off. His eyes were still on me, waiting for something. Maybe an apology. Maybe fear. I clenched my fists. I have a dad, I said again, my voice steady. And it's not you. For a second, I thought he was going to hit me. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. But instead, he exhaled sharply and turned away. Ungrateful little brat, he muttered under his breath, grabbing his beer off the table and stomping out of the room. Mom looked at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. Then she sighed and followed after him, leaving me standing there alone. I realized then that my mother wasn't just ignoring what was happening. She was part of it. I knew I had to do something before I lost myself completely. Living under the same roof as George was like being trapped in a pressure cooker, and I could feel the anger building inside me every day. I wasn't a scared kid anymore, but I also knew that standing up to him physically would only make things worse. He wanted me to break, to lash out, so he could turn around and say I was the problem. I couldn't give him that satisfaction, so I found another way to take control. I started going to the gym. At first, it was just a way to get out of the apartment, to put some distance between myself and the toxic atmosphere at home. But soon, lifting weights, hitting the punching bag, and pushing myself past my limits became the only thing that made me feel sane. It wasn't just about getting stronger. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't powerless. That was where I met Manuel. He was a former boxer, somewhere in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a thick accent that made every piece of advice sound like something out of an old-school training montage. At first, he barely acknowledged me, just gave me a nod whenever I came in. But he must have seen something in the way I trained. The way I threw punches like I was fighting ghosts. The way I pushed through exhaustion like I was running from something. One evening, after watching me struggle with my form on the heavy bag, he walked over and tapped my shoulder. You punch with anger, he said. That's no good. You gotta punch with control. I scoffed, wiping sweat off my forehead. Yeah? And what if I don't want to control it? He just shook his head. Then one day, you lose. And not just a fight. You lose yourself. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I kept coming back. And little by little, he started teaching me, not just how to fight, but how to stay in control, how to breathe, how to move, how to pick my battles. By the time I turned 18, I knew that if George ever put his hands on me, I could put him on the ground in seconds. But that wasn't the answer. He wanted a reaction, and I wasn't going to give him one. Meanwhile, George was getting worse. It wasn't just at home anymore. He started trying to intimidate my dad, too. It began with little things. At parent-teacher conferences, he would stand just a little too close to Greg, staring him down, making comments under his breath. Then he started showing up at places he had no reason to be. After Sophie's school concert, I saw him leaning against his truck in the parking lot, watching as Dad walked to his car. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I saw the way he smirked, the way he made sure Dad noticed him before getting into his truck and driving off. I confronted Mom about it, but she just waved me off. Oh, don't be ridiculous, Adam. George isn't doing anything. Your father is just being dramatic. But I knew what was happening. George wanted control, and that meant making sure Dad knew he could reach him whenever he wanted. I wasn't going to let it continue. I started planning my way out. The night everything changed started out like any other miserable dinner at home. The four of us sat at the table while George shoveled food into his mouth, barely pausing between bites to grunt about his day. Mom was sitting beside him, nodding along, laughing at his terrible jokes, acting like she wasn't completely lost in whatever version of reality she had created for herself. Sophie and Jake were quiet, like always. We had all learned to keep our heads down, to eat quickly, and get through meals with as little interaction as possible. It was easier that way. Then Sophie's phone buzzed. She glanced down at it for barely a second, just enough to read the notification, when George's chair scraped against the floor. Without warning, he reached across the table, snatching the phone right out of her hands. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, holding the phone up. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "It's just a text." Before she could even finish, George hurled the phone across the room. It smashed against the wall, the screen cracking instantly before it clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the apartment, a sharp reminder of just how easily he could break things. Sophie's hands trembled in her lap, her face pale. She didn't cry, but I could see the way she clenched her jaw, trying to hold herself together. Jake, sitting beside her, shrank down in his chair, gripping his fork so tight his knuckles turned white. That was it. That was the moment I knew I was done. I pushed my chair back slowly, standing up. George turned to me, his expression daring me to say something. "You got a problem, tough guy?" I could feel the anger simmering under my skin, the same rage I had been holding back for years. But I didn't throw a punch. I didn't scream. I just stared him down, my voice calm and steady when I spoke. "Touch her again," I said, "and you'll be sorry." The room went dead silent. George's smirk faltered for just a second, but I saw it. He knew. He knew that whatever control he thought he had over me was gone. He might have been bigger, louder, meaner, but I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I turned to Sophie and Jake. "Get your stuff. We're leaving." Mom shot up from her seat, panic flashing in her eyes. "Adam, don't be ridiculous." I ignored her. Sophie didn't hesitate, standing up immediately, while Jake looked between us, unsure. "Now," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Jake stood up, and that was it. We walked out the door without looking back. The moment we walked out of that apartment, I knew there was no going back. I had no idea what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. None of us were ever setting foot in that place again. We went straight to Dad's house. I barely got the words out before he was pulling us inside, checking Sophie and Jake over like he expected to see bruises. When I told him everything, every outburst, every broken door, every time Mom had chosen George over us, his face went pale. Then it turned red. I had never seen him that angry before. The next morning, he called a lawyer. The court process moved faster than I expected. Greg sued for full custody, and when it came time for us to testify, none of us held back. Sophie told them about the phone, about how George had grabbed it right out of her hands and smashed it. Jake talked about the time George punched a hole in the wall over a cup holder. And I told them everything else. All the times he had broken things, screamed, stalked my dad, tried to force us to call him Dad. Mom sat there through it all, silent. She didn't deny anything. She didn't argue. She just sat next to her lawyer with this hollow look in her eyes, like she knew she had already lost. When the ruling came, it wasn't even close. Greg got full custody. The court ruled that Mom could only see us in public places, cafes, parks, places where there were other people around. She lost any right to have us stay with her overnight. She tried calling me after that, but I didn't pick up. For the first time in years, we had a home again. Not just a place to sleep, but an actual home. Dad went out of his way to make sure we felt safe, like nothing and no one could get to us anymore. And Mom, she kept reaching out at first. "Adam, we need to talk. Can we just meet for coffee? You don't understand. I never meant for things to get so bad." I ignored every single message. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. She let that man into our lives. She let him hurt us. And when we needed her the most, she protected him instead of us. There was nothing left to say. Life after leaving Mom and George behind felt like stepping into the sunlight after years of being trapped in a storm. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. No more walking on eggshells, no more waiting for the next explosion, no more pretending things were okay when they weren't. It was just me, my own choices, my own future. After high school, I started working as a personal trainer. It wasn't just a job, it was something I actually loved. The gym had saved me when I felt powerless, and now I got to help other people find their own strength. It felt right. The long hours didn't bother me, and I liked seeing progress, not just in my own life, but in the people I trained. Eventually, I saved up enough to rent my own place. It wasn't anything fancy, a small apartment, nothing like the big house I had grown up in, but it was mine. No yelling, no broken doors, no tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Just quiet. I also got a dog, a German shepherd named Tora. I had always wanted one, and now that I was on my own, nothing was stopping me. She was protective, smart, and full of energy, always ready for a run or a game of tug-of-war. Having her around made the place feel less empty. Most importantly, I was free. No more George. No more Mom trying to justify the unjustifiable. No more waiting for things to get better when I knew they never would. I had built a life for myself, one where I was in control. And for the first time in years, I was at peace. 5 years passed without a single word from my mother. No calls, no messages, nothing. I didn't think about her much, and when I did, it wasn't with anger anymore. It was just indifference. She had made her choice, and I had moved on. My life was my own now, and I had no reason to look back. Then one evening, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. The moment I heard her voice, I knew. "Adam," she said, breathless, frantic. "It's me. It's Mom." I didn't say anything, just waited. "It's George," she continued. "He fell," and her voice broke. "An ambulance took him away. He's having heart surgery." I almost laughed. Of all the things I expected, this wasn't it. She kept talking, her words rushed and desperate. "I need help, Adam. Lily is all alone, and I can't leave the hospital. Can you please come and look after her?" That was when I did laugh. A short, dry chuckle. "Sorry," I said, my voice calm, steady. "But that's not my problem." Silence. I could almost hear the realization sinking in on her end. The understanding that whatever connection she thought still existed between us was long gone. "But Adam, please." I hung up before she could finish. Then I put my phone down, gave Tora a scratch behind the ears, and went back to my life. Mom didn't give up as easily as I had hoped. After I hung up on her, I figured that would be the end of it. She'd get the message and move on. But the next morning, she called again. And again. When I didn't answer, she left a voicemail. "Adam, please. If you don't want to come here, I understand. But what about Lily? She has no one right now. I could bring her to you, just for a few days." I deleted the message without responding. That night, around midnight, someone started knocking on my apartment door. I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. I didn't open it. I just stood there, arms crossed, listening to her muffled voice through the door. "Adam, please," she begged. "I know you're in there. Just talk to me." I stayed silent. She knocked again, harder this time. "I just need a few minutes." I leaned against the door and sighed. "Go home, Mom." A pause. Then, a shaky exhale. "You're really going to do this?" "You did it first." I walked away. Eventually, she left. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, she showed up at the gym while I was training. I had just finished a set when I heard my name being called. I turned around and saw her standing near the entrance, out of place among the weight racks and punching bags. I clenched my jaw. "You need to leave." She shook her head, eyes red and tired. "I don't know what else to do, Adam. I don't know where else to go." For the first time in years, I saw something in her face that almost looked like regret. Almost. But I wasn't the same kid who used to crave her approval, who used to hope she would finally choose us over him. I wiped sweat from my forehead and grabbed my water bottle. "I'm not taking Lily in," I said flatly. "That's your responsibility." "She didn't do anything wrong," Mom whispered. "She never deserved this." I sighed. She was right about that. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my banking app, and sent her just enough to cover a few days of care for Lily. Then I held up the screen. "There," I said. "That should be enough for a sitter or a hotel. But that's all you're getting from me." She stared at the screen, her lip trembling. "You can't just walk away forever," she said. I met her eyes. I already did. Then I turned and went back to work. A week passed without hearing from Mom, and I hoped, that she had finally given up. I had done my part, sent money for Lily's care, and made it clear that I wasn't going to be pulled back into her mess. Life went back to normal. Work, training, walking Tora in the evenings. Peace. Then one afternoon, a friend sent me a message. "Dude, you're not going to believe this." Attached was a screenshot from Facebook. It was a post from Mom's account. "Thank God George is home. Family is everything." I stared at the screen, rereading the words, waiting for the anger to come. But it didn't. There was no shock, no frustration, no betrayal. Just confirmation of what I had already known. Mom hadn't called me out of regret. She hadn't begged for my help because she finally realized what she had done. She just needed a backup plan for a few days until George was back. And now that he was, everything was back to normal in her world. I didn't respond to my friend. I didn't even think about it. I just pulled up Mom's profile, blocked her, then went through every other platform and did the same. She was gone now. For good. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Life moved forward, and so did I. Cutting my mother out for good didn't leave an empty space. It left room. Room for real things. Real relationships, real goals, real peace. I kept working as a trainer, but I wasn't just clocking in and out anymore. I was building something. Saving money, making connections, learning the ins and outs of the business. I had a plan now. In a few years, I was going to open my own gym. Not just some corporate fitness center, but a real gym, the kind of place that took people in when they felt lost and gave them something to hold on to. The way Manuel had done for me. Greg was proud. He didn't say it often, but I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way he talked about me to his friends, the way he showed up every time I needed him. He had always been there, no matter what. And in the end, that was the real difference. George had spent years trying to convince everyone he was a real man. The tough guy, the provider, the head of the household. But the truth was, he was nothing. He had power over us only because we had no choice. The second we did, we left, and he was just a bitter, broken man with no one who actually cared about him. I had become everything he wasn't. Not because I could fight, or because I made my own money, or because I stood my ground, but because I didn't need to control anyone to feel strong. I didn't need fear to feel important. I built something real. I became someone people could trust, someone they could rely on. I became a man. And the best part? I didn't even need revenge. Living well, moving forward, becoming something more than what I came from. That was enough. So what do you think? Was I too harsh with my mom? Should I have handled things differently? Or did she make her choice the moment she let that man into our lives? Let me know. I'm curious to hear what you'd have done in my place.